In this video, we're going to talk about resolution. Resolution means the number of pixels per square inch of your image. If we zoom way into an image, way in, you start to see these little dividers. Each one of these dividers is dividing one pixel from the next. And we zoom in a little further. There we go. So you can see each one of these little pixels is making up this image. It's like a mosaic in real life. If you put enough tiny little pieces together and then you back out far enough, it looks like one cohesive face or unit, even though it's made up of all these little tiny parts. Well, that's the way Photoshop works. It's a bitmap program. Generally speaking, there are some vector elements in it, but normally what we're doing is working in bitmap mode, which means every single pixel of this image is mapped out, and each little pixel, if we look at the info palette right here and I click on a pixel, you can see up in the corner here, and if I move my cursor it'll move everything, it is giving us the formulas for the color up at the very top, both in RGB and CMYK, tells us it's an 8-bit image. Below that it gives us the XY coordinates, which is its location from the top left corner. And then to the right of that, if I had a selection made, it would give me the height and width of that. It's also giving me the document size at this point. I have a single layer, so the flattened version versus the layered version is the same in this case. If I had multiple layers, those two numbers would be different. But it's giving me a formula and a location for every single pixel in this entire image. That is how it works. So I'm going to go back to my 50% view here, and let's take a look at it. And if you look at this, it looks very similar to the one, if not exactly the same, that's at 250% view. If you look up at the top tab, we see the first one was at 50% of screen resolution. That means that could be twice as large and still be perfectly fine quality for screen resolution. This one is being enlarged over its actual screen resolution. If I were to bring this down to the resolution, that's what size you'd see it if you were putting it on a web page, roughly. And my screen resolution on this monitor right now is 72 pixels per inch. If your monitor's set differently, which most are, then this would be a little bit smaller even, because those 72 of those little squares per inch would now be 100 pixels in a square, so you'd be a little bit smaller in your actual presentation of this image. This one, however, if I put this one at 100%, I'm going to have to put the number in down here, or I can do the Command or Control ++ to get it to 100%. So if this one is now at 100%, that is what we are seeing at 100% screen resolution. So there's quite a bit of difference when we're at 100%. That is the ideal size for that one. At screen resolution, this is the ideal size for that one. So think about that. That means if I copy this one over, select it all, copy, and then go back to here and paste it in, look at the difference in size. It's huge. It's absolutely huge. That's because this one was at 72 pixels per inch at a smaller overall dimension. And the original file size, if we go up here and look at it, it's 300 pixels per inch at 12 inches by a little over 17. I turn that off, a little over 17.63, a little over 17.5 inches. So what you're doing here is you have to account for how many of those little pixels you have. Now, if I try and take the smaller image and put it into a large composition, it's going to be not a great choice. So let's blow this up, and this is not a really great or elegant way to do it, but we're going to do it just to show you the different result. Okay, so I've just now enlarged this. Photoshop does a really good job of trying to figure out what it should be, but you see we're getting some noise in here, how the edges don't have fidelity. When I go back to the original without it being upsized, and this is what the difference is. So you can see the amount of degradation that we've caused by trying to upsize this and put this into the same size resolution that the other was in, the original was in. So that's something to be really careful of. If you go online and grab pictures from online to do projects for a class, which you wouldn't do for professional purposes because everything is copyrighted pretty much, unless you're using stock photography or you're licensing it, or it's in the public domain, such as the NASA website, nasa.gov, then you really need to be careful about getting as much resolution as possible for a project that's destined to be printed. You want to get 300 pixels per inch at the destination size if possible. The tough part about Photoshop is the more pixels you start with, the easier it is to upsize it. The fewer pixels you start with, the harder it is to get really good quality when you make it larger. So you want to try and start with the most pixels you can find in an image that represents what you want. Okay, so that's what we're looking at. If you look at this from far out, you're not going to really see a lot of difference. You can see a little bit of difference there, but not a lot. But it's when you kind of are printing it out, you're going to see all of that degradation and how it's kind of falling apart, getting real pixelated, getting kind of furry and blurry. And back here, we have a lot of really, really fine detail. We've got a little bit of the pollen dust there, and you're just not seeing that on the one that's been upsized. So when we're talking about resolution, in order to find out what the resolution of anything that you're looking at is, go to image, image size. That will tell you up here the total number of pixels. It tells you you can fit it to certain sizes. In this pull down menu, you've got a whole bunch of presets here if you want to resize it. If I have the resample button clicked off, it means I do not want to add or subtract any pixels, so it will change the resolution when I change the dimensions, or vice versa, but it will keep the exact same number of pixels. If I click on the resample button, what happens is I can change the number of pixels. If I change it down to the number of pixels for screen resolution, for instance, you see how it just dropped a whole bunch of pixels here. It just erased them, took them away. We went from 5300 pixels down to 1272 pixels. So that's a pretty huge and major difference. So that is image resolution. You also have under the image menu canvas size. That's basically if you were looking at this in terms of not computer, not digital, but real world with a piece of paper, a piece of canvas that you were painting on. This is the size of your canvas or your piece of paper. So in this case, you can see it's also the size of your print. That this would print out at 12 by the 17 and a little more than a half. You can change that number, add pixels to it. Add edges to, you can change that number and add to your canvas size. You can also add a certain number of inches or pixels or percentage or centimeters, etc., all those different things to the overall canvas size. So if I added 10 inches to the width and 10 inches to the height, what that means, because this is in the middle here, it's going to add 5 inches to the top, 5 inches to the bottom, 5 inches to the left, 5 inches to the right. If I click OK, that's what we're going to see is those 5 inches added to each side. I'm going to undo that and go back to canvas size. If I were to add the 10 inches, if I wanted to add them differently to the borders, I could click up here. Now it's going to add those blank pixels over here where it's kind of blanked out and keep the original image right there. Let's take a look at what that looks like. And there it is. Okay, so that's how you use that canvas size dialog box. I'm going to undo that one more time. Go back to canvas size. If you click off the relative, what it's just going to do is add or subtract pixels evenly along all the sides. So if I come in here and say I want this to be 16 by 10, it's going to snip off some edges, and it's going to always warn you unless you tell it not to. So if I proceed, what it's going to do is crop in and snip off or trim off some of those edges. If you put a negative number when you have relative clicked, it will do the same thing depending on what measurements you put in there. So that's a very, very, very quick primer on resolution. Check it out when you pick up an image, whatever your image is. You want to have maximum number of pixels you can. That gives you flexibility. If you can't find maximum number of pixels, then you have to realize you're going to lose some quality if you upsize or enlarge your image. Ways to avoid that: work with Camera Raw. There's some good filters in there. If you go to the Camera Raw filter, you can, and especially if you're working with images that are raw, when you originally open an image and open it in Camera Raw, you'll have a little dialog box down here that you can click on, and that was one way to enlarge your image. It may not be the best. I actually have found some plugins that work very nicely, and they come in under my Automate. One of them is Topaz Gigapixel, and I use that quite a bit. There are others out there, but they will help enlarge your image without losing as much quality as you would sometimes in Photoshop. You also, under the neural filters now, have another filter, and you may have to download this, but it's called Super Zoom, and if you turn that on, then you can also enlarge this way, and it does a very, very good job. So that's another option, and you should be aware of that as well. So the main thing here is you want to keep the quality of your image. The better the quality is, the more pixels you have, the more easy it is to make great selections, to make great adjustments, and to use it in whatever form and whatever composition you want to use it. And that's it for right now with resolution.